When we immerse ourselves in the epic lines of the Iliad and the Odyssey, a world of heroes, gods, and passions unfold before us. But behind the poetic images lie real events that Homer kept silent about, leaving us captive to myths. Today, thanks to archaeological discoveries and historical research, we can lift the veil of mystery and find out what really happened during the Trojan War. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and let's get started. Imagine a narrow sea passage connecting two vast bodies of water. Every ship wishing to pass from one to the other is forced to go through this bottleneck. Whoever controls this passage controls trade, collects duties, and, in essence, holds the economic fate of entire regions in their hands. Such a place was the Hellespont Strait, now known as the Dardanelles, and the mighty Troy stood guard at its gates. Its location was not just fortunate, it was ingenious. The city towered over the plain, overlooking the entrance to the strait leading to the rich lands of the Black Sea coast. From there, from the region that the Greeks would later call Pontus Euxinus, the hospitable sea, came an endless stream of ships laden with grain, a vital resource for rocky and not very fertile Greece. In addition, this route provided access to deposits of metals, copper, tin, gold, everything that formed the basis of the power of Bronze Age civilizations. The Trojans, taking advantage of their position, could levy a tribute on every passing ship. Refusing to pay meant either seeking a detour, an incredibly long and dangerous route, or risking being attacked from the impregnable walls of the city. It was not just a toll, it was a price to pay for access to prosperity. For the ambitious Mycenaean kingdoms, whose power was built on trade and military campaigns, Troy was not just a rival, it was an obstacle. The 10-year siege described by Homer in this light looks not like an act of revenge for insulted honor, but like a large-scale, carefully planned investment. The capture of Troy would mean direct, duty-free access to the resources of the Black Sea and the elimination of the main economic competitor in the region. Helen, for all her legendary beauty, was merely a convenient pretext, a casus belli that could unite the scattered kings and inspire the warriors to a long and bloody campaign. The real prize was the keys to the golden gates of the Hellespont. The sun slowly sank behind the Gisarlik hill, painting the sky in crimson tones. German merchant Heinrich Schliemann, obsessed with Homer's poems since childhood, looked at the excavation site stretching deep into the earth. He believed that beneath this layer of dust and oblivion lay the very city celebrated in the Iliad. His workers, armed with pickaxes and shovels, dug through the centuries, unaware that they were destroying one history in order to find another. Schliemann was looking for one Troy, but found a whole kaleidoscope of cities buried one on top of the other. Homer describes Troy as a single monolithic city, the great Ilion with its high towers. But archaeology, which began with Schliemann's amateurish but enthusiastic excavations in 1870, revealed a completely different picture. Troy is not a city, but an archaeological layer cake, where each layer represents a separate era, a new city built on the ruins of the previous one. There are 9 main layers in total and more than 40 sublayers. The city that is most likely Homer's Troy belongs to the layer designated by archaeologists as Troy 7a. It dates back to approximately 1300-1180 BC, which coincides perfectly with the supposed time of the Trojan War. And the findings in this layer speak for themselves much more eloquently than any poem. The walls of this city bear clear signs of fire. Human remains were found in the streets, abandoned without burial, evidence of a sudden and brutal massacre. In the houses, archaeologists discovered large vessels for storing food, pithos, dug into the floor. This suggests that the inhabitants were preparing for a long siege by stockpiling water and grain. Achaean-type arrowheads were found everywhere, stuck in the walls and scattered across the pavements. The picture painted by these silent witnesses is devoid of poetic flair. It is a chronicle of desperate defense and brutal assault. The Stones of Troy 7a do not tell of heroic battles or the intervention of the gods. They scream of hunger, fear, and the fire that engulfed a thriving city in a single night. Archaeology has confirmed the reality of the war, but has stripped it of its Homeric nobility, revealing its true ruthless face. When reading the Iliad, we imagine a united Greek army, united by a common goal under the leadership of King Agamemnon. However, the word Greeks would be an anachronism here. In the 13th century BC, there was no single state or nation on the Balkan Peninsula that we now call Greece. The world from which Agamemnon, Achilles, and Odysseus came was a patchwork quilt of independent and often warring kingdoms. This was the Mycenaean civilization, named after its most powerful center, the gold-rich Mycenae. In addition to Mycenae, there were Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes, dozens of fortified citadels, each headed by its own ruler, Avanica. These kingdoms were tightly centralized, bureaucratic states whose lives revolved around the palace. They fought each other, entered into dynastic marriages, and traded actively throughout the Mediterranean. They were united by a common language and similar culture, but not by political unity. Why were these eternal rivals able to unite for such a large-scale campaign? The answer again lies in economics. An enterprise that promised enormous spoils and control over the most important trade route was a compelling enough reason to temporarily put aside their internal strife. It was more like the creation of a joint stock company to implement a large business project where each king invested his assets, ships and warriors, in anticipation of future dividends. Agamemnon of Mycenae, as the most powerful of the kings, acted not so much as the supreme ruler as the chairman of the board of directors of this temporary military alliance. Homer, calling their army sometimes the Achaeans, sometimes the Danaans, and sometimes the Argives, intuitively reflected this fragmentation. These were not the names of a single people, but the names of tribes or inhabitants of separate regions. Thus, the great army of the Achaeans appears not as a single nation avenging its violated honor, but rather as a temporary alliance of predators, united to hunt prey that was too large and rich. Homer's epic depicts warriors whose valor is measured in duels, where honor and glory, kleos, are the highest currency. However, clay tablets inscribed with the mysterious linear B script and found in the archives of Mycenaean palaces tell a completely different story. These documents are not heroic poems, but dry accounting reports. There is not a word about Achilles' wrath or Odysseus's cunning. Instead, there are meticulous records: 120 chariots, 240 wheels, 50 suits of armor, 100 swords. The Mycenaean kingdom appears before us not as a gathering of noble leaders, but as a totalitarian, militarized bureaucracy. The entire economy was subordinate to the palace, which controlled production, distributed resources, and maintained a standing army. The warrior who went into battle under the walls of Troy was a product of this system. His equipment was not a unique gift from the gods like Achilles' armor forged by Hephaestus. It was the result of standardized production. Let us recall the famous helmet made of boar's tusks, which Homer describes as an ancient relic passed down from generation to generation. Archaeological finds confirm the existence of such helmets, but they were apparently a standard piece of equipment for elite warriors, not a unique artifact. The same applies to armor. The complete bronze panoply found in Dendera, cumbersome, consisting of 15 separate parts, is more reminiscent of the equipment of a medieval knight than the light armor of Homer's hero. Such armor made a warrior virtually invulnerable to swords and arrows, but it restricted his movements, turning him into a slow-moving fighting machine, effective in close formation but not in maneuverable combat. Their main weapon was not swords, but long spears designed for phalanx combat. And the chariots, which in Homer's work serve only as prestigious taxis to transport heroes to the battlefield, were in reality a formidable striking force. Driven by a charioteer, they carried an archer or spearman, rushing along the enemy ranks and showering them with projectiles. It was a tactic of intimidation and exhaustion, not a noble duel. Thus, the Battle of Troy most likely resembled not a series of spectacular skirmishes, but a brutal, methodical clash between two well-organized Bronze Age armies, where the outcome was decided not by personal valor and the will of the gods, but by logistics, numbers, and discipline. But who opposed this Achaean war machine? Homer depicts the Trojans and their allies as almost identical to the Achaeans, speaking the same language and worshipping the same gods. This created dramatic unity, but distorted historical reality. Troy, or as its inhabitants probably called it, Vilusa, belonged to a completely different cultural world, the Anatolian one. Its inhabitants most likely spoke Luwian, one of the Indo-European languages of Asia Minor, related to the language of the powerful Hittites. It was the Hittites who were the shadow force that Homer did not mention. In the 13th century BC, the Hittite Empire was a superpower that controlled most of modern Turkey and Syria. And in its diplomatic archives, found in the capital of Hattusa, documents were discovered that shed light on the true geopolitical situation of the Trojan War. These cuneiform texts repeatedly mention the country of Ahiava, a powerful kingdom across the sea, with which the Hittites sometimes fought and sometimes formed alliances. Most historians today agree that Ahiava is the Achaean world, that is, Mycenaean Greece. In one of the most famous documents, the so-called Letter of Tabagalava, the Hittite king addresses the ruler of Ahiava as "my brother," equal to me in rank, which indicates the recognition of the Mycenaeans as an equal power. But the most striking thing is the mention in Hittite texts of the city of Wilusa, which geographically and phonetically coincides remarkably with the Greek Wilion, Ilion. There is even a treaty concluded between the Hittite king and the ruler of Wilusa named Alexandru. This name is practically an exact Anatolian transcription of the Greek name Alexandros, which was the second name of the Trojan prince Paris. Thus, a completely new picture emerges. The Trojan War was not just a local conflict between the Achaeans and the Trojans. It was an episode in a long and complex confrontation between two superpowers of the Bronze Age, the Hittite Empire and the Mycenaean world, Achaea. Troy, Vilusa, was apparently a vassal kingdom, or junior partner of the Hittites, a strategically important outpost on the border between their spheres of influence. The Achaeans' attack on Troy was, in essence, a blow to the interests of the Hittites, a bold invasion of their zone of control. Why did the Hittites not come to the aid of their ally? Perhaps at that moment their own empire was already falling apart under the pressure of internal problems and external enemies. Or perhaps they considered helping too risky. Be that as it may, Homer's silence about the Hittites is a deafening silence that conceals a whole layer of international politics, turning the story of the kidnapped queen into a chapter of the global confrontation between ancient empires. But even this confrontation was only part of a larger drama unfolding throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The end of the 13th and beginning of the 12th centuries BC is a period that historians refer to as the Bronze Age collapse. It was a systemic collapse comparable to the fall of the Roman Empire. Powerful civilizations that had flourished for centuries collapsed overnight. The Hittite Empire disappeared from the face of the earth. The thriving cities of Ugarit and Alalak on the Syrian coast were burned to the ground. Egypt, although it survived, was thrown far back, losing all its Asian possessions. And the Mycenaean civilization itself, the victor in the Trojan War, fell into ruin just a few decades after its triumph. The reasons for this collapse are still the subject of fierce debate. One of the main theories is a sudden change in climate. Paleoclimatological data indicates the onset of a prolonged period of drought, which led to crop failures and mass starvation. In a highly centralized palace economy where all resources converged at a single point, such a crisis was fatal. When the palace granaries were emptied, the system collapsed. Internal uprisings began, and peasants and artisans abandoned their cities in search of food. This chaos gave rise to a new phenomenon that Egyptian chronicles refer to as the peoples of the sea. This was not a single people, but a conglomerate of desperate and embittered groups, pirates, refugees, former warriors from collapsed kingdoms who sailed along the coast in their ships, sweeping away everything in their path. They did not seek to conquer lands, they plundered and burned. Among these peoples of the sea, Egyptian inscriptions mention tribes whose names suspiciously resemble the Achaeans, Ekvesh, and Danams, Denyen. This gives rise to a terrible irony. It is quite possible that yesterday's besiegers of Troy, returning to their homeland and finding their own homes in flames, themselves became ruthless marauders, becoming part of the very wave of destruction that swept away their world. In this global context, the Trojan War appears not as a unique heroic deed, but as one of the last acts of the bloody agony of an entire civilization. It was a desperate attempt by the Mycenaeans to seize resources and living space in a world that was rapidly descending into chaos. Their victory turned out to be a Pyrrhic one. They captured the smoking ruins of the city, but returned to a world that was already doomed. Their own magnificent citadels, Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, soon suffered the same fate as Troy. They were burned and abandoned. That is why the famous story of the Trojan horse, which, incidentally, Homer does not describe in the Iliad, it appears only in the Odyssey and later texts, may have a deeper and darker basis than simple military cunning. Of course, there is no archaeological evidence of the existence of a giant wooden horse, but this legend could have been a poetic metaphor for real events. One of the most convincing theories links the horse to the god Poseidon, one of the main Olympic deities, whose sacred animal was the horse. But Poseidon was not only the god of the seas, but also the earth shaker, the god of earthquakes. The region of Troy is a seismically active zone. Perhaps a powerful earthquake damaged the city walls, which the Achaeans took advantage of for their decisive assault. In the minds of the people of that era, such an event could be interpreted as divine intervention. Poseidon, with his horse, earthquake, broke through the way into the city for the Achaeans. Another, more prosaic version sees the horse as an allegory of a siege weapon. Battering rams, especially large ones covered with wet skins to protect them from fire, could resemble a bulky animal from a distance. Horse could have been a code name or colloquial nickname for such a machine, which over time became overgrown with legendary details. In any case, the story of the horse is most likely an attempt by later generations to explain how an impregnable stronghold that had withstood a 10-year siege could fall in one night. And so, when the fires died down and the victors divided the spoils, night fell. Not just the night after the battle, but the long, dark night of civilization that went down in history as the Greek Dark Ages. This period, which lasted almost 400 years, was a time of total regression. With the fall of the palaces, the complex writing system disappeared, and Linear B was forgotten. Greece became illiterate once again. Monumental construction ceased, and art and crafts degenerated to a primitive level. The population declined sharply, with people abandoning ruined cities and returning to a semi-natural economy in small, isolated villages. International trade came to a standstill. The world shrank to the size of a single valley. It was in this darkness that tales of the great past were passed down from mouth to mouth. Bards and Aedi, wandering from village to village, sang of the golden Mycenae, of the great heroes who fought beneath the walls of sacred Troy. Passed down through generations, these stories became embellished with mythical details and lost their historical accuracy, but they preserved the most important thing, the memory of past greatness. Homer, who lived at the end of these dark ages, when Greece was just beginning to emerge from the gloom, was not a historian or chronicler. He was a brilliant poet who collected these scattered oral traditions and wove them into a single majestic tapestry. He looked at the past through the 400-year chasm of oblivion, and in his view, the ruins of the Bronze Age were transformed into a world of gods and heroes. He did not so much conceal the facts as recreate the lost world as the collective unconscious of a people who had survived a catastrophe wanted to remember it. His poems are not so much the history of the Trojan War as a grandiose epitaph to the entire Mycenaean civilization, a monument to a world that burned in the flames of its own final triumph. Moreover, the citadel that Schliemann excavated was only the tip of the iceberg. Modern research using magnetometry, conducted by archaeologist Manfred Korfmann, revealed to the world something that Homer did not even hint at: the existence of a huge lower city. It covered an area of almost 30 hectares surrounding the citadel and was protected by an impressive defensive moat carved into the rock. This moat, 4 meters wide and 2 meters deep, was the last line of defense, designed to stop enemy chariots. The population of such a city could reach 5,000 to 10,000 people, making Troy not just a royal fortress, but one of the largest metropolises of its time in the region. It was a bustling, multinational center where not only the Luwian language was spoken, but also the languages of merchants from all over the Aegean and Black Seas. Within its walls, the lives of craftsmen, merchants, and sailors bustled, people whose fates and aspirations were ruthlessly erased from the heroic narrative, giving way only to royal figures and warriors. And who were these warriors? The famous Catalogue of Ships in the second song of the Iliad is, in essence, the battle order of the Achaean army, a list of contingents and their leaders. For a long time, it was considered a poetic invention. However, a detailed analysis of geographical names has shown that many of the places mentioned in it were significant centers during the Mycenaean era, but fell into decline and were forgotten by the classical period. This proves that the catalogue is based on authentic oral tradition dating back to the Bronze Age. But here, too, poetry diverges from reality. Homer describes a fleet of more than 1,000 ships. The real Mycenaean ships, which we find depicted on vases and frescoes, were not so much combat units as means of transport. They were rowing vessels with a single sail and a shallow draft, capable of carrying between 30 and 50 warriors. They were not intended for naval battles as we understand them. Their task was to transport the army to the enemy's shore. The very idea of a 10-year continuous siege is also a poetic exaggeration. No Bronze Age army had the logistical capabilities to sustain such a long and distant venture. Feeding tens of thousands of soldiers for 10 years would have been impossible. It is much more likely that the siege was a series of seasonal campaigns. The Achaeans arrived in the spring, set up camp on the coast, fought, and then either returned home or dispersed throughout the region for the winter. Achilles himself in the Iliad reveals the true nature of the war when he boasts, "I destroyed 12 cities with ships, 11 on foot on the Trojan shore." This means that Troy was not the only target. The Achaean camp served as a base from which raids were carried out along the entire coast of Asia Minor. The war fed itself. They captured livestock, grain, slaves, metals, everything that allowed them to continue their campaign and enriched their leaders. Thus, the Trojan War was not a static siege, but a dynamic raiding expedition, where the capture of the city itself was only the final, albeit most important, chord. Life in the Achaean camp, which Homer describes as a place of heroic feasts and gatherings, was in reality grim and dangerous. The crowding of thousands of people on a small stretch of coastline, the lack of basic sanitation, and contaminated water sources all created ideal conditions for epidemics. It is no coincidence that the Iliad begins with a plague sent by Apollo upon the Achaean army. This is probably a poetic interpretation of very real outbreaks of typhus or dysentery, which mowed down warriors no less effectively than Trojan spears. The diet of a common soldier was far from the roasted meat and wine enjoyed by the heroes of the epic. It consisted mainly of barley cakes, olives, dried fish, and diluted wine, everything that could be brought along or obtained in the vicinity. Death from wounds was painful, as medical knowledge was primitive, and any serious injury almost certainly led to infection and gangrene. The heroism extolled by Homer flourished on the soil of despair, disease, and the constant threat of death, which the poet chose to remain silent about when creating his idealized picture of war. The collapse of this world was not only sudden but also total, and its causes were interrelated like a domino effect. In addition to climate change, a key factor was the disruption of trade routes. Mycenaean civilization, like the entire Bronze Age world, was critically dependent on two metals, copper and tin. Copper was mined in Cyprus and elsewhere, but tin was a rare resource. It was transported from far away, possibly from Afghanistan or even the British Isles, through a complex network of intermediaries. When the Sea Peoples and general chaos paralyzed maritime trade, this tin stream dried up. Without tin, it was impossible to produce bronze. And without bronze, it was impossible to create weapons, armor, tools, the entire material basis of civilization. Palaces, whose power was held by armed troops clad in bronze, found themselves powerless. Their armies could no longer replenish their arsenals. It was at this moment that iron entered the historical scene. It was not a new metal, it had been known before, but it was considered low quality, difficult to process, and was used mainly for decoration. But in the context of collapse, iron had one undeniable advantage. Its ore was found everywhere. Now every village could have its own blacksmith, capable of forging a primitive but fully functional sword or spearhead. The power based on the monopoly on bronze collapsed. A kind of democratization of weapons took place. Disparate groups of rebels, refugees, or simply bandits armed with iron weapons were able to challenge the palace armies, whose bronze swords and spears had been depleted. This was a technological shift that completely changed the rules of the game, and is not mentioned at all in Homer's poems, which are frozen in the Bronze Age. The fate of those who survived this catastrophe was unenviable. Legends about the return of heroes are, in essence, stories about a world that did not wait for them. Agamemnon, returning victorious to Mycene, was treacherously murdered in his own bath by his wife Clytemnestra. Other heroes wandered for years, like Odysseus, or found their kingdoms plunged into civil war. This is a poetic reflection of the real chaos that engulfed Greece. The surviving Trojans scattered across the Mediterranean. The later Roman legend of Aeneas, the Trojan hero who rescued his father and son from the burning city, and after long wanderings founded a new dynasty in Italy, becoming the ancestor of Romulus and Remus, is not just a figment of the imagination. It reflects real migration processes. Flows of refugees from Asia Minor and Greece did indeed rush westward to Italy and Sicily, bringing with them their legends and cultural traditions. Thus, the fall of Troy, which marked the end of one world, paradoxically gave impetus to the birth of another. In the minds of descendants living amid ruins and memories, the Trojan War became a symbol of a lost golden age, a point of no return, after which the world plunged into darkness. It was grand enough to be remembered and tragic enough to be sung about. The victory, which turned into defeat for everyone, became the perfect material for an epic. Homer, standing on the other side of the Dark Ages, did not simply tell a story. He created a myth about the origins, explaining to his contemporaries, the descendants of those who survived the catastrophe, who their great ancestors were and what kind of world they had lost. He gave them a shared memory that helped them become a united people again. In this sense, his silences were no less important than his words, for it was they that made it possible to transform the cruel and sordid story of plunder and destruction into an immortal poem about human valor, tragedy, and glory. The true nature of the alliance that opposed the Achaeans was also much more complex than simply the Trojans and their allies.
Homer lists the peoples who came at Priam's call, the Lycians, Carians, Phrygians, but presents them only as an exotic backdrop to the main drama. In reality, it was a conglomerate of peoples belonging to a vast and ancient cultural community that scholars call Luwian. The Luwians were an Indo-European people related to the Hittites, and their language and culture dominated most of Western and Southern Asia Minor long before the arrival of the Greeks. They had their own hieroglyphic script, completely different from the Greek Linear B, and worshipped their own pantheon of gods, headed by the god of thunder, Tarhunt. Thus, it was not just two armies that clashed beneath the walls of Troy, but two different worlds, two cultural blocks, the Mycenaean Achaean and the Anatolian Luwian. For the warriors of Sarpedon of Lycia or Nostos of Caria, this war was not just a matter of helping a neighbor, but of defending the borders of their world from an aggressive and alien neighbor from across the sea. Their motivation was as deep as that of the Achaeans, but their voices are almost inaudible in the epic. They are merely shadows doomed to fall at the hands of Greek heroes. The very structure of power, both in Troy and Mycenae, was distorted by poetic tradition. Homer's kings, Basileus, resemble the leaders of the heroic age. They feast with their retinue, personally lead their warriors into battle, and their authority is based on personal valor and generosity. However, the ruler of the Mycenaean kingdom, the Wanaka, was a figure of a completely different scale. He was not just a military leader, but a sacred king, the representative of the gods on earth and the center of all economic and religious life. The palace was not just his residence, but a gigantic administrative complex, temple and production center all in one. The silent lists of palace scribes reveal the Vanaka's total control over all aspects of his subjects' lives, from harvesting crops and issuing rations, to craftsmen, to keeping track of livestock and distributing bronze to armory workshops. Next to him stood the figure of the Lavagitus, the supreme military commander, which indicates a separation of secular and military power, something Homer does not even hint at. In the Iliad, Agamemnon is forced to argue and persuade other kings. His authority is contested. The real Vanaka of Mycena most likely possessed much more absolute and bureaucratically formalized power, and his campaign against Troy was not an adventure of a group of independent leaders, but a state operation planned and supported by the resources of the entire palace economy. The religious life of this world was also far from the Olympian passions described by Homer. The gods of the Mycenaeans, whose names we find on the tablets, are Poseidon, Poseidon, Zeus, Diwo, Hera, Era, Athena, Atana Potenia, appear not as schemers and participants in battles, but as recipients of meticulously recorded donations. To King Poseidon, 1 measure of barley, 10 cheeses, 1 sheep. To all the gods, 1 measure of honey. These are not prayers and hymns, but accounting records. Religion was part of the state economy, a way to appease the formidable forces of nature and ensure the well-being of the kingdom through precise and regular rituals. No large temples similar to later Greek ones have been found in Mycenaean citadels. Religious rites were apparently performed in small shrines inside the palace or in open areas. It was a religion of contract and ritual, not of personal belief and dramatic intervention.
Homer, who lived centuries later, imposed entirely new, human-like characteristics on these ancient names of gods, creating an immortal drama but concealing from us the true, far more formal and frightening face of Bronze Age religion. But Homer's most deafening silence is about the fate of the civilian population. War in the Iliad is the business of male warriors. Women appear only as the cause of conflict, Helen, faithful wives, Andromache, or mourners, Hecuba. The reality was immeasurably more terrifying. The main economic outcome of any successful raid or capture of a city was the taking of prisoners, primarily women and children. They were the most valuable part of the spoils. Men were usually killed on the spot. But women artisans, weavers, spinners, potters were living capital. Tablets have been found in the archives of Pylos, where strict records are kept of captive women, Raviaya, from various cities in Asia Minor, such as Cnidos, Miletus, and Lemnos. They are listed together with their children and their professions. These women became slaves in the palace workshops, and their labor was the basis of the prosperity of the Mycenaean elite. Textiles, fabrics, cloaks, tunics were one of the main export goods of the Mycenaeans, and it was produced by the hands of nameless captives whose cities had been burned and whose husbands and fathers had been killed by the very heroes celebrated by Homer. The tragedy of Andromache, whom Hector predicts will be enslaved in a foreign land, was not a poetic metaphor. It was standard operating procedure in Bronze Age warfare. The course of military operations also required a completely different level of organization than that described in the epic. Keeping an army on a foreign shore for 10 years is not only a question of food, but also of fresh water, waste disposal, maintaining discipline, and preventing mutinies. The Achaean camp on the coast was, in essence, a temporary city that had to function somehow. Archaeological research in the area of the supposed camp has revealed traces of semi-permanent structures and even a cemetery, confirming the long-term nature of the Achaean presence. Maintaining morale in such conditions was a huge problem. It is likely that the constant raids on neighboring cities served not only to obtain food, but also to give the soldiers an outlet for their aggression, an opportunity to enrich themselves, and simply a change of scenery, avoiding the destructive routine of trench life. In this light, Achilles' famous anger over the capture of his captive Briseis appears not simply as an insult to his honor, but as a rebellion by a key field commander whose successful raids provided a significant part of the army's supplies and morale, against the supreme commander who was trying to redistribute the spoils in his favor. It was a conflict not so much of honor as of logistics and resource allocation. The filter of the Dark Ages, which let the memory of the war slip through, weeded out all these complex and unsightly details. Oral tradition is incapable of preserving the structure of the bureaucratic apparatus or the intricacies of international trade in memory. It clings to vivid images, strong emotions, and archetypal plots. The complex, multi-layered reality of the Bronze Age was simplified into binary oppositions: Greeks versus barbarians, valor versus treachery, fate versus will. The names of real kings and heroes, cities and rivers were preserved, but the socio-economic and political context in which they lived and acted was lost and replaced by a picture of the world of the tribal system that was more understandable and familiar to the audience of the Iliad. Homer did not deceive his audience. He spoke to them in the only language available to them, the language of myth. He took the fragments of a shattered civilization and pieced them together into a mosaic that was not historically accurate, but psychologically and culturally true to his time. He gave the Greeks, emerging from 4 centuries of darkness, a great past and a common identity, transforming the bloody agony of the Bronze Age into a heroic prologue to their own history. These facts reveal that the Trojan War was a multifaceted event that went beyond Homer's narratives. From economic motives to global crises, they enrich our understanding of antiquity, reminding us that history is often hidden behind layers of myth. Thanks to modern research, we can appreciate both the poetry and the reality behind it.